I'm Missy, the Time Machine teacher, and today we are going to talk about Unit 9, which is all about globalization after 1900. Grab your notebooks, let's get started. As always, we're going to start with context. The context of the 20th century or the 1900s, we have World War I going on, World War II going on, and then of course the Cold War. The Soviet Union falls in 1989. That's also when the Berlin Wall comes down and Germany is unified into one country. Due to the fall of the Soviet Union, there are reforms throughout Eastern Europe that bring Eastern Europe more into the modern age. Political alliances expand as well as economies and nations. Also, advancements in science and technology during this time frame, such as the internet. The big theme in this unit is all about globalization and the connections that start to happen. Remember back in Unit 4, we talked about globalization at that time and how trade was connecting the world. Now it's going to be that even more so in the 1900s. Also, social and political change, especially with international trade. And of course, just like anything else, we have positives and negatives with globalization. Positives, of course, would be that there's more information spreading, more free markets start to emerge during this time, more human rights for minorities, better technology means better communication, and more international cooperation. Negatives, deforestation, problems with scarcity of water, spread of disease, terrorism. We'll talk about that more later. You could say the push for this globalization is after the Cold War ends, now countries want to start to cooperate a little bit more together. Let's first talk about the new technology. Radios bring news to the world, as well as TVs, internet, and computers. Shipping increases with big shipping containers. In the early 1900s, people had the ability to make long-distance phone calls, and now there's almost nowhere in the world that you can't call, except for some very remote places you might need a satellite phone. But for the most part, you can call just about anywhere. During the 20th century, social media will also play a big part in history. Remember the Arab Spring movement? Social media played a huge role in spreading information about that. Across North Africa and the Middle East in 2010s. The Green Revolution also takes place during this time, where scientists start to come up with new forms of hybrid plants that are more drought resistant. These new varieties are crossbred hybrid plants of rice, wheat, and other sorts of grains. Scientists begin to use genetic engineering, which changes the basic makeup of the cell or organism. Farmers also start to use more irrigation, pesticide, and fertilizer. Of course, there are some problems that come with the Green Revolution. Small farms couldn't compete with larger farms in terms of having enough money to buy the fertilizers and the pesticides. Because farming becomes more mechanized, laborers begin to lose their jobs, and the environment is damaged by the new products that are being used. Also, some feared that there would be loss of the old seeds as more seeds were genetically produced. In the beginning of the 1900s, the main source of fuel is coal. Then humans start to turn more towards petroleum and natural gas, and then nuclear power, as well as wind and solar generated power. The problem is that coal, oil, and natural gas are all non-renewable resources, so once we use them up, we won't have any more to use. They also lead to air pollution, which puts greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Nuclear power is a good option, but it is dangerous. It's possible that it could leak or explode and harm the communities around it. Also, during this time frame, we have medical advancements such as antibiotics and vaccines. Antibiotics really helped the troops during World War II and then spread to the civilian population a little bit later. Birth control is invented in the 1950s and fertility rates start to decline. Vaccines are invented before the 1900s, but they're not widely used until the 1900s. And they've been almost successful in getting rid of diseases such as smallpox and polio. That pretty much covers Unit 9.1. Moving on now to Unit 9.2. Unit 9.2 discusses how diseases persist during this time. Most of these diseases are related to poverty, and some examples are malaria, tuberculosis, cholera, and some new epidemics such as the flu and HIV or AIDS. The reason these diseases are linked to poverty is based on how they spread. For example, malaria spreads through mosquitoes and is a big problem in poverty-stricken areas. Doctors Without Borders began giving vaccines as well as passing out mosquito nets in some of these areas to help prevent the spread of malaria. Tuberculosis is another one. However, you can get vaccines for that one as well. Cholera spreads through bad water, which is a problem in poverty-stricken areas. And polio also spreads through contaminated water. It causes paralysis and sometimes death. Vaccines have helped with this one as well, and first came out in 1955. 6 years later, they had an oral vaccine produced as well. The other reason this affects high poverty areas is because access to vaccines is limited in those areas, as well as access to clean water. There has been a global effort to eliminate polio through vaccines, and with this global effort, it has been eliminated in all but a few nations. The flu is another big one. We talked about how it affected the troops who were coming home in World War I, and they brought it with them. And then it spread throughout the United States as well as the rest of the world and became a pandemic. More people died of the Spanish flu than died in the bubonic plague. There was also a big debate back during the Spanish flu about masks and if masks actually worked. Somewhat similar to the debate that we recently had about COVID. And believe it or not, there were groups who were anti-maskers at that time as well. HIV and AIDS also affects high poverty areas because there are some drugs that helps people live with HIV or AIDS now. However, they don't always have access to that in the high poverty areas. So the majority of people who live with HIV or AIDS are those who live in developing countries and have access to those new drugs. Ebola is another bad one. This one spreads through African fruit bats as well as other primates and into humans. It causes the organs to shut down, and in most people it causes death. The WHO has worked with many nations to try to eliminate this disease. However, in 2014, there was a massive outbreak in West Africa. The WHO at that time, World Health Organization, led the fight against that outbreak in West Africa. Some other diseases that affect people today is heart disease. This one is associated with lifestyle and genetics. It usually comes later in life, but with heart transplants and new medicines, people are living longer with this disease. Alzheimer's disease is another disease that has emerged. People with this disease lose their memory, and there is no cure, unfortunately. With globalization comes effects on the environment, such as deforestation or cutting down trees to make new areas for farmlands and cattle raising, desertification, which is removal of natural vegetation, and the intensive use of arid lands for agricultural purposes. There's also a decline in air quality because of air pollutants, and science have also noticed that the climate is changing. Why is all this happening, you ask? It's mostly due to population growth. In 1900, there were 1.6 billion people. That population jumps to 20.6 billion people by the year of 2000. That put more stress on the environment because there was a demand for more food, and therefore more deforestation had to follow. It also put pressure on the farms because there was more urbanization. So there's a huge population in the cities that now need more food to be grown, and natural resources were in high demand for industry. Long-term effects is that eventually Earth will run out of those non-renewable resources that we talked about earlier. For example, petroleum may last up to another 30 or 40 years. Coal could last a little longer and won't be depleted until about 60 years, according to scientists. There's also water scarcity, and more than 1 billion people don't have access to clean water. Imagine that. It's just crazy to think about. The access to water is also linked to inequality. Developing countries usually have less access, and it affects the education of girls mostly in those countries because the girls are the ones that are sent to the wells to fetch water. If they're fetching water, that means they can't be educated because they can't be in school during that time. The pollution is also leading to changes in our atmosphere, and we are losing forests due to deforestation, which also doesn't help the air pollution. In 1968, there was a group formed called the Club of Rome, and this was a group of scientists that wanted to promote global change. The Green Party is more recent and also fights for global change. There are debates about global warming. Is the temperature actually rising on Earth? Scientists say, yes, indeed, that is true, and that we need to reduce our carbon footprint, or the carbon dioxide that we produce that's causing the carbon dioxide to be put into the atmosphere. They are predicting that if this doesn't change, we will have more global warming, which will lead to more extreme weather, such as massive hurricanes and tsunamis. However, like with anything, there are skeptics, and those who question global warming resist the changes and the government regulations. However, most leaders agree that we need to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide emissions that are put out there. In 1997, developed nations signed the Kyoto Protocol, which was an agreement to try and reduce carbon emissions. Global action was taken in 2015 in the Paris Agreement, where developing nations agreed to make changes. President Trump withdrew the U.S. from this agreement. However, President Biden put us back in 2021 when he took over the presidency. Let's switch now to talk about economics. After the Cold War, there was definitely more global trade. Ronald Reagan, who was the president of the US at the time, and Margaret Thatcher, who was prime minister in England, advocated for cutting taxes, regulations, and government assistance for the poor. The Eastern Bloc opens up when the Soviet Union falls. India and other countries that hadn't participated in the Cold War now want to participate in international trade. And there's more what's called economic liberalization, which would mean more free markets that are based on supply and demand. And that's exactly what Reagan and Thatcher were pushing for. Critics of this said that globalization would lead to more exploitation and environmental damage. There's also some political ties to what's going on with economies. In 1973 in Chile, the U.S. helps back a coup to put Pinochet in charge. He is ousted by a group of citizens in 1990 because of the violent way that he ruled. During his rule, though, he did open Chile up and make it more of a free market and allow businesses to privatize. He did bring about some reforms, but they didn't really address poverty, and that didn't make the public happy. After he was ousted, new government administrations continued with free trade, and they did try and fix poverty. Moving on now, in China in 1981, Xiaoping is leader. During his leadership, the Communist Party backed off, and the economy opened up a little bit more. Communes were stopped, and peasants were allowed to lease the land. This improved production and ended famines. Factories started making more consumer-based products, and foreign companies were allowed in. Businesses also became privately owned, and China became a more economically driven country. At the time, some Chinese also wanted political reform, such as freedom of speech and the press. Education was also guided by the government, and they wanted to reform that too. In 1989, protesters took it to the streets in Tiananmen Square and protested their political rights. It was a peaceful protest led by students and intellectuals of the country. However, China didn't like it. They sent in troops to break up the protest, and they killed hundreds. Despite this actually happening, Chinese students don't learn anything about the protest in schools. It's blocked from the internet in China, and the government claims that no one was killed and that it was a story that the West made up. They also imprison anyone who memorializes that J? They also imprison anyone who memorializes that day, which was June 4th. Other struggles in China are due to the demands of the ethnic divisions in China. There are calls to give Tibet more freedoms and allow them to have more autonomy. There has long been discrimination against the Uyghurs that has now turned more into a violent genocide against them. The growth of social media is blamed for the clash between the Han and the Uyghurs in China. Even though most social media is banned in China, they do have their own form of Facebook. And the discrimination against the Uyghurs was put out there on this form of Facebook before the genocide started. There's also conflict between the Mongolian nomads in Mongolia and the Han Chinese who are moving in and kind of taking over that area. And this conflict is caused by the disruption in Mongolian nomadic lifestyles. Another part of the economy that changes is called the knowledge economy, which is basically how information is created and how it's distributed. One example is the Silicon Valley in California. This is where employees collaborate and create new technology. Finland has also moved to a more knowledge economy. After World War II, Finland was mostly an agricultural nation. They provided a lot of food for the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet Union collapses, they lose a big customer. And that's when they start turning towards a knowledge-based economy. They also invest greatly in science and education, and this has led them to be very successful in the technology market. Japan takes a different approach after World War II as well, and they start using mercantilist policies. They want to increase exports and decrease imports. To encourage exports, the government helps finance labor policies in large corporations. They also put high tariffs on imports and trade restrictions on goods that are going overseas. Education became very important in order to prepare the workers. The U.S. also invests in Japan at this time, and they become one of the leading manufacturing countries in the world. The downfalls of this are that the workers are not paid very much, and they couldn't afford the products that were being produced. Since then, unions have gotten stronger and there are better wages now. Japanese economy has also gotten into banking, finance, and technology as well. One continuity throughout this time is that as knowledge economy increases, industrial economy declines. Manufacturing moves from the US and Europe to Latin America and Asia. For example, Vietnam and Bangladesh export billions of dollars of clothing. Unfortunately, they have very low wages and poor working conditions for the people in those countries. The NAFTA agreement, which is an agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the US, was basically formed to use low-wage factories in Mexico to produce goods for the US and Canada. There are also poor working conditions in these factories, and it's mostly women who work there. On the side of the US, many US workers lost their jobs as their jobs went to Mexico. Honduras is working on better treatment for its workers, as well as using more recycled products in order to be more sustainable. After World War II, there were global trade organizations that were set up. Tariffs were lowered through these, which allowed for more international trade and prosperity in places that were devastated by World War II. One of these organizations was the WTO, or the World Trade Organization. It was created in 1995, and it governs 90% of international trade. Unfortunately, they mostly favor corporate interests and ignore the morality of manufacturing, such as sweatshops being used in child labor, which is still a problem today. They also govern fair trade to try to ensure that those making the products get a fair price. However, one moral part that they do get involved in is fair trade, trying to make sure that those making the products get a fair price. Also during this time, multinational corporations are created. These are corporations that exist in one country but sell to many different countries. These are comparable to the 1500s versions like the East India Company. Modern day examples would be Microsoft and Google. These multinational corporations are sometimes criticized because they don't always have a home country and they don't always follow moral codes like a regular corporation would if they had a home country. And sometimes they use child labor, such as the Swiss Nestle company, who was accused of that at one time. Child labor is a tricky subject because we all know that it's not good for the children. They need to be in school, they need to be educated. The problem is that oftentimes children are used to collect the raw materials that might end up in your cell phone one day. For example, mica is mined by children in the mica mines. By the time that resource gets to the manufacturing plant that is going to make the cell phones, it's already passed through several middlemen. So the excuse of those buying it is, well, we don't really know where it comes from. Yeah, it may be child labor, but how do we stop that? What's our responsibility in that? They didn't buy it directly from the people who are putting children to work. The other side of the coin is child labor happens in high poverty countries, and oftentimes those families whose children are doing these jobs need that money in order to buy food for the day. And so if those jobs are taken away from those families, how will they survive? That's why child labor is something that is so hard to stop, because there needs to be something put into those countries that will allow the parents to make a living so that their children don't have to work and they can be educated instead. Despite the challenges with ending child labor, there are some organizations who are working on it. There are other reforms to move towards better human rights, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It states that everyone should have the basic human rights and the fundamental freedoms. The UN also promotes human rights, and they have a child's emergency fund called UNICEF to help children in need. There's an International Court of Justice that was set up by the UN. This is supposed to help with international law and border disputes and anything that needs to be solved in the courts on an international level. The UN also tries to protect refugees and provide for them basic needs. The UN has a very interesting makeup. Within it, there's a General Assembly, and there's representation for each nation that is a part of the UN within the General Assembly. Also, within the UN is a Security Council. They act on issues that the General Assembly debates and sometimes use military force when needed. There's a branch called the Secretariat, which is the UN administration branch, the International Court of Justice, which we've already discussed, and an Economic and Social Council. They promote green energy, and they also fight for raising wages in poorer countries. Another goal of the UN is peacekeeping, and they try not to use their military, sometimes to the detriment of the country. For example, the UN did not intervene in the violence in Rwanda, which would later result in a genocide, and that's something that they could have potentially stopped. And their goals are also to help feed the poor and provide education in developing countries. There are also NGOs, or non-government organizations, that help support the UN. And in 1944, the World Bank was created, and this was to give loans to countries in need. Let's switch now to gender equality and global feminism. In 2017, there was a women's march in Washington, D.C. that quickly spread throughout the world. All of these marchers were marching for women's rights. There have been cultural and religious movements. The Negritude movement was in support of blackness in West Africa. It rejected French colonialism and supported the right for self-determination. There's also been a movement called liberation theology, which mixes socialism and Catholicism. It spread throughout Latin America. It called for people to be free of abuses, both socially and politically. Many dictators called for the killing of its leaders. There was some success in Nicaragua, where it helped oust the dictator there. In the 20th century, there were steps towards gender equality, first in the U.S., where white women get the vote in 1920. Native American and African women will fully get the vote later with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. British women get the vote in 1918, but at the time they had to own property in order to do so. In 1928, though, British women gained the same voting rights as men. In some places today, women have the right to vote, but they don't have access to vote. For example, Pakistani women got the right in 1947, but in 2013, only 10% of the vote were women. There have also been steps towards racial equality. The 1965 Voting Rights Act in the United States, as well as the 1965 Civil Rights Act, outlawed discrimination against race in regards to voting and discrimination as a whole. However, the U.S. is still struggling with getting rid of systematic racism that affects minorities today. South Africa has its own struggles with segregation and discrimination through apartheid that originally started in 1948 and deeply segregated the blacks and whites there. It was a result of colonization. Nelson Mandela, the leader of the ANC, or African National Congress, was imprisoned for his efforts in trying to get rid of apartheid, and there was a global movement to try to get him released from prison. He served 27 years and was finally released, where he worked with the government and eventually becomes president of South Africa. At that time, he worked to unify the country. He started the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that sought to restore and unite South Africa. Those who were put on trial for what they had done during apartheid didn't receive punishment, but received amnesty instead. He wanted them to be forgiven so that the country could grow from it and move on. He also used the rugby team to unite the country again. Check out the movie Invictus. It's a really good portrayal of what he did with the rugby team during that time. Caste in India is still a problem during this time as well. In 1949, the Constitution outlawed any discrimination against the untouchables, which was the lowest class in the caste system. And it was said that if you touched an untouchable, you had to wash and clean yourself and purify yourself again. However, despite these laws, discrimination continues into the 21st century against these people. Earth Day starts in 1970 and promotes recycling and taking care of the earth. We also see after World War II a more globalized culture. There's more modernism, more consumer culture, so people concerned about buying things, and new technology to spread these goods. If we take a look back on some changing politics, we know that during the time of imperialism, everything was very competitive. That leads to World War I and World War II, where there's more competition and more power struggles. And during that time, bonds are strengthened between allies. And then the Cold War, which divides the world. But after the Cold War, countries are going to become closer through trade and regional trade groups. Social changes overall, scientific social changes, better communication, transportation, and spread of knowledge through the internet. Artistic changes are happening, such as Cubism, which is how Picasso paints. The Harlem Renaissance, which is a rebirth of African American culture. Jazz spreads throughout the world. There's also a phenomenon called Americanization, where American culture spreads throughout the world and is very popular throughout the world, such as Levi jeans. English also spreads. Global brands such as Apple and Nike use online commerce to spread their products. And the big online commerce giant, Amazon. Despite this Americanization happening, there's also global culture that's spreading as well, such as Bollywood, which is the Indian film industry, anime spreading from Japan, K-pop coming from Korea, reggae from Jamaica, and social media changes the way we communicate with each other. With this globalization came global culture and religion. There's a movement called the Hare Krishna movement. This is based on Hindu scriptures, but it's considered a New Age religion. Other religions were adapted to make them more appealing to Western culture. Some countries, such as Saudi Arabia, China, and North Korea, resist globalization. And some even resist the WTO and trade organizations. And just like with anything else, there are definitely negatives with globalization, such as increased child labor, complaints of working conditions. Even in Western nations, there are complaints of working conditions in factories like Amazon, and for sure complaints in countries where the wages are low and the working conditions are bad. There's also environmental damage with the deforestation and greenhouse gases getting into our environment. And another negative is threats to national sovereignty. The example of this is Brexit, when Britain wanted to leave the European Union so that they could have more autonomy. Opponents to it said that it would cause Britain's economy to be very bad, and that's why they end up not withdrawing. Overall, in Unit 9, there are a lot of changes with globalization, culture, trade, better communication through the internet, better transportation through airplanes, more agricultural tech through genetically modified crops that are more drought resistant and disease resistant, social changes for women and minorities, economic changes, and sometimes that can be bad because the more developed nations take advantage of less developed nations. Political changes lead to more democracy, a consumer culture being created, and more culture spreading around the world in general, and environmental changes, pollution, and water scarcity. And that wraps up Unit 9. Thank you so much for listening, and as always, if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure and do so, and click that notification bell so that you don't miss a thing. I'll see you next time. Stick around for outtakes, which changes the basic makeup of the organization. Japan. And we are losing forest, which help with the carbon dioxide. So